Good evening, everybody. My name is Bill Miller, and on behalf of the Conejo Open Space Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation, our third webinar of the 2025 COSF Speaker Series titled Oh Dear with ecologist Ellie Bolas. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Conejo Valley is located on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Chumash people, who have lived here for thousands of years. The Chumash are the original stewards of this land with a deep cultural and spiritual connection to the valleys, coasts, and mountains of this region. We honor the Chumash communities, past, present, and emerging, and express our gratitude for their enduring care of this land. We recognize their ongoing contributions to the cultural and ecological richness of the Conejo Valley and beyond. As residents, we commit to learning from and respecting Indigenous knowledge and history, and to supporting efforts that uplift Indigenous voices and sovereignty. Our vision at the Conejo Open Space Foundation is to inspire the community to act to preserve our Conejo natural open space, its trail systems, cultural heritages, and unique ecosystems so that they will be protected and enjoyed for generations to come. As mentioned, Ellie Bolas is our presenter tonight, so a little bit of information about her. Ellie is a PhD candidate in ecology at the University of California, Davis, studying how human activities impact wildlife behavior and species interactions. Ellie has been invested in wildlife research and conservation in the Santa Monica Mountains for almost 15 years. She moved to the area in 2011 and has worked for several years in science outreach and education prior to beginning work with the National Park Service in 2014. In 2020, she completed a Master's of Science in Ecology from UCD on the ecology and conservation of island spotted skunks on the California Channel Islands, right here in our backyard. Ellie's work has been featured on NPR and in the Washington Post, as well as the LA Times. So that said, without further ado, Ellie, the show is yours. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Bill, and thank you all so much for inviting me to speak, for attending. I love talking about deer, so I'm really excited to get to be here and talk with you all tonight. Before we go too far, I just want to request, please don't take any photos or screenshots of this presentation. I'm definitely sharing work that's still in progress, and so everything I'm sharing is stuff that's part of my dissertation. So Bill already kind of gave you a little bit of an introduction to me, but just to give you a little more info before we get into the fun stuff, the deer, I'm a behavioral ecologist and conservation biologist, and my motivations are to do research that supports applied conservation, management, and human-wildlife coexistence. So what does that actually mean? In practice, I use a variety of tools. So I use camera traps, animal observations, genetic tools, as well as tracking animals in order to study wildlife behavior and their habitat use. So where are they and what are they doing, as well as species interactions and populations. And then I use that information to help inform conservation and management of wildlife populations. And I have a particular interest in understanding the impacts of human-caused disturbances on wildlife behavior, and then letting that help us understand how we can manage animals better. And so those human-caused disturbances are things like fires or climate change, development, recreation, roadways. So with that background as a scientist, that certainly is part of the work that I'll be sharing with you tonight, but I also wanted to give you a little bit of my personal background, which Bill alluded to, and that's in part because the work I'm sharing tonight is deeply personal for me. So as Bill mentioned, I actually worked in science education and outreach for over 10 years. I moved to the Santa Monicas in 2011 as part of that career, and I was teaching students from the greater Los Angeles area natural history and ecology lessons. I lived off Yerba Buena Road for several years, and I became deeply invested in understanding the ecology of our mountains, whether that was the mountains themselves or also the ocean. As you can see here, we're leading a shark dissection. So because of that excitement about understanding what was happening in our mountains, while working full-time, I started to volunteer with the National Park Service at the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. And initially that work was a really cool project using wildlife cameras to study the impacts of the 2013 Springs fire on wildlife communities. I loved being involved in that research so much, and it was actually a throwback to my undergraduate research that I moved on to, as Bill mentioned, do a master's degree, and that was at UC Davis, studying the ecology of island spotted skunks and island foxes out on Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa Islands. Also an amazing experience. And the best part was that while I was doing my master's work, I continued to be involved with the NPS. Prior to graduate school, I had actually moved on to work as part of their mountain lion project, and that's the photo you can see here. I'll let you decide if you think a mountain lion kitten or an island spotted skunk is cuter. But all of this came full circle as I was finishing up my master's, and I was able to begin my PhD back in the Santa Monica Mountains, working full-time with NPS to study how humans are impacting mountain lions and their main prey, deer. So I wanted to just share my path a little bit with you all because I've been invested in this ecosystem for almost 15 years. And I still think of my students as I'm doing my current research. And this is research I really love sharing with local people because these animals are your neighbors, and it's important for us to understand how we can live with these together. And it's also fun because some of this research, some of the questions I'm exploring are things that I've been thinking of for a really long time, since back when I was hiking around with my students. I love talking about mountain lion research, and we did have a fun paper come out in November where we were exploring how mountain lions are impacted by recreation in the Santa Monica Mountains. And I think I originally considered myself more of a carnivore biologist, but for tonight, we're going to focus on deer. Happy to circle back to mountain lions if people are interested. I have come to love talking about deer, and so let's go forward with that. So the outline for tonight, I'm just going to start with a broad overview of some mule deer ecology. We'll get into some of the specific goals of the research on the deer in the Santa Monica Mountains, talk a little bit about how we actually go about studying them, and then I'll share with you some of the things that we're learning. And I want to first introduce some of the members of our research team. Science is collaborative. We can't do it by ourselves. And in fact, it's much better when we have a bunch of diverse minds involved. And I'm extremely lucky because I get to work directly with the National Park Service and biologists from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife on this research. And so I want to highlight the photo in the bottom left there is Jeff Sikich, our mountain lion biologist, and Seth Riley, the wildlife branch chief, both from the National Park Service at Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. Longtime friends and amazing collaborators. In the top right, there's a picture. In the back of a picture is Jeff Brown, the wildlife ecologist that we work directly with on this project. We also have an amazing team of interns, technicians, and volunteers. And I especially want to acknowledge our volunteer, Chris Bartell, who took many of the photos that you'll see in this presentation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mule deer ecology. So the first thing to know is that here in California, we have mule and black-tailed deer. And I've got this map up showing you the range. Mule and black-tailed deer are found in the Rockies and then to the west. If any of you are from the Midwest or the East Coast, you're more familiar with white-tailed deer, which also occur in Canada and have moved west into parts of Washington. I'm not right now going to go into all of the amazing, interesting specifics of the different ecotypes of mule and black-tailed deer. There at one point have been 11 different subspecies categorized. The important thing here is that the yellow is what our deer are, the California mule deer. So a couple ways to help us identify or characteristics of muleys. One is, of course, the really large mule-like ears. They also have a white rump. They have a long, ropey tail with a black tip, or sometimes kind of a black all the way down the tail in the case of black-tailed deer. And then they have forked antlers, which comes into play if you're a hunter and you're trying to count how many points. We count points differently for mule deer as compared to whitetail. Another iconic thing about mule deer is this really incredible gait called a pronk or a stot. And if you've ever seen it before, it kind of looks like they're a pogo stick because they have all 4 feet in the air at the same time. White-tailed deer don't do this, unfortunately for them, because it's very cool. And it's a gait that's thought to have evolved for living in rugged country and being able to navigate that terrain and avoid predators. Mule deer are ruminants. So like cattle, they have a 4-chambered stomach and they have to redigest their food. So they actually spend a good amount of time and energy each day chewing their cud. They are what's called an intermediate feeder, and they browse on both woody vegetation and herbaceous vegetation. Up to 80% of their diet is woody vegetation. It's worth noting that in a lot of the West, mule deer are migratory, and that's so they can track seasonal vegetation. So in other words, in winter months when there's less vegetation, they move to a different home range as compared to the home range that they use in the summer when there's more vegetation. For our deer in the Santa Monica Mountains, we have not yet conducted a formal diet study, but we've seen them eating chamise, mustard, ceanothus, mallow, deerweed, acorns, oak leaves, sagebrush. In other words, they eat a lot of different kinds of vegetation. And perhaps what's most funny to me about their diet is I've watched a mule deer where she had fresh green grass right next to a dry desiccated shrub, and she went for the shrub. So there you go. Another cool thing about mule deer is that they grow a new set of antlers every year, and that's just the bucks that do that. Antlers are the fastest growing bone in animals, and when they start growing, they're actually a spongy material, and the growth is promoted by velvet, which is a highly vascularized tissue that surrounds the antlers. Around midsummer, those antlers will harden and the velvet will shed. And all of that timing is actually influenced by androgen secretion, which is influenced by day length. The size of antlers is influenced by age and nutrition, although it's not necessarily the case that each year of a buck's life, he's going to have a new fork. So in the case of this buck, who is a healthy, mature individual, he has 4 points. I've never seen, or we would call him a 4x4. I've never seen a deer with 5 points in the Santa Monica Mountains, but I have seen really strong, mature old bucks that are a fork or only have 2 points. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the research goals that we have for this project. And I guess the first thing we need to cover is why you might study mule deer. So one is that they are important economically and ecologically. Important in terms of hunting as a resource, but also for recreationists just to see them. Ecologically, they're a major herbivore. So that right there means that there's something we need to understand. Also, their populations are declining in the West, and that's because of a variety of potential causes, including habitat loss and modification, disease, and increased hunting mortality or roadway mortalities. In terms of disease, you may have heard of chronic wasting disease, which is a prion disease that's been spreading across the West. It just arrived in California last year, and that's a big concern for deer populations. There's also very limited study on mule deer in urban systems. And of course, human populations are growing, but we don't have a good sense of how deer might be responding. And that's important because any of you who have spent time in the Midwest or East know that white-tailed deer are actually very common in urban areas and almost considered a pest species. And so part of the motivation of this work is to try and understand what mule deer are doing in more urban systems. And so that brings us to why we're studying them here in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. So if any of you are from out of town, I just wanted to orient you to where this study is taking place. The Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area includes the Santa Monica Mountains, the Simi Hills, the Santa Susanas. And what I really want to highlight here is that this is an ecosystem that is heavily modified by humans. So we've got those major freeways going through. We've got Los Angeles right there with a lot of development. And the mountains themselves are kind of a mix of public and private lands. And then I'll also point out really a notable thing in our ecosystem here is the development of the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Overpass, which is going in right where that arrow is. If Here's a photo from Monday of how the construction is coming along. It's very exciting for us. And I'll talk more about the implications of that overpass for deer in our system as we go along. So here's another image of our study system. This is the second largest metropolitan area in the United States, and it truly is a mixed use landscape. And so we've got these neighborhoods right next to wild spaces. And basically the point is animals can't get away from people in the Santa Monica Mountains. Everything is shared. And so that's one reason that it's important to be doing these studies here. Additionally, deer are the largest herbivores in our mountains, which means that they are having a really significant impact on vegetation. On that note, another thing that's interesting about this system is the seasonal variation in resources. So I mentioned early that in a lot of the Western United States, mule deer migrate, and often in giant herds, hundreds of deer. And that's tracking seasonal resources and looking for that nutritious food in the summer, sneaking by in the winter. But of course, in the Santa Monica Mountains, things are really different. So this photo of this deer is from September, and the summer is our resource limited season. It's our dry season. There is not a green speck around her, whereas the winter is our time of abundance. Another key thing about this ecosystem, of course, are the frequent and severe wildfires. So this is a photo I took in March from Topanga Canyon Fire Road. This is an image of an area that was burned by the January 2025 Palisades fire. And then finally, deer are the main prey of the mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains and actually make up roughly 80% of their diet. The greater LA area is one of 2 megacities in the world with a large felid predator. And so our mountain lion population is actually a really amazing and important population to understand. And so part of our management and research for mountain lions means understanding their main prey species, which is deer. By the way, I'm just going to apologize. My cat is a little worked up this evening. Hopefully his yelling isn't coming through, or it's just adding to the presentation. So I guess he knew we were on the mountain lion slide. So taken together, in terms of our research goals for deer here, there's actually a lot of reasons to be studying deer here, and they haven't been studied before. And so that means that actually anything we learn is really valuable information. So things like their general ecology, how big are their home ranges? How do they use habitats? What are their mortality sources? Of course, how they respond to people, which is a major focus of all of the National Park Service research in this area. Additionally, of course, we're very interested in that predator-prey relationship with mountain lions, and then we're also curious about the impacts of fire. So that's a lot of things we're trying to understand. And the research on deer in the Santa Monica Mountains started relatively recently. So NPS started it up in 2017, looking at deer responses to the 405 freeway around the Sepulveda interchange. And then the research expanded in 2020, which is when I joined the project with a study along Liberty Canyon. We also began the Samo Deer Project, which is a range-wide study, as well as a study along the 118 at Rocky Peak. In 2023, we began studying deer along the Conejo grade. And then this summer, we'll be targeting animals in and around the Palisades and Franklin fires. So I just want to pause here to emphasize the complexity of these projects. It's actually really takes a lot of work to get information about the animals we want to study. So generally about a year to figure out the logistics, buy callers, get permits, set up the team, a couple years to actually deploy GPS collars or cameras on these animals and then have them run around and collect data for us. Then we're going to be analyzing the data for a year or two, and then we're going to be writing about those data and sharing those results. Right now, we're about a year into data analysis on all those different questions that I was just sharing with you. And so that's to say that the information I'm sharing today is still very much a work in progress. We don't have answers to all of our questions yet, but stay tuned. Everything we learn is exciting at this point. So how do we study mule deer? Well, to do this, we need to deploy GPS collars on them so we can follow their movements. And that means capturing them. And we do that one of 2 ways. One is in what's called a clover trap, which is pictured here. And this is a trap that has a metal frame and net siding. We bait the trap with alfalfa and apples, and then once the deer is in, we physically restrain her and then pull her out to be processed. The other option is free darting, which is where we use a small CO2-powered rifle to shoot a dart and chemically immobilize a deer. For either method that we're using, it's a ton of time just out looking for deer, hiking, looking for their tracks and sign, scouring the mountains to try and figure out the best places to capture them. Once a deer has been captured, we are going to physically restrain them, and that's what Dustin is doing in the middle of the picture here. He's a colleague from CDFW. He's got his hands over her legs that have been hobbled. Jeff Brown from the National Park Service and I are measuring this deer's neck to get her ready to fit a collar. And then Henry, our intern, is probably doing the most important thing, which is taking her temperature. And that's really important to monitor vitals. And that's something we do throughout every capture. So for example, in this image, you can see Zach is wearing a stethoscope, and he's going to use that to monitor breathing and heart rate. And then there's a little blue cord with a clip attached to her tongue, and that's what we're using to monitor her oxygen levels. I'm putting a collar on her in this image, and I just want to tell you a little bit more about the collars. So they are 1.5 pounds, which is less than 2% of a deer's body weight. So it's equivalent to an adult human wearing a pair of shoes. The collar takes a GPS location every 1 to 2 hours by connecting with satellites. And the deer wear the collars for 1 to 2 years, and then the collars drop off automatically. The other thing we do is give the deer ear tags, and that's so we can tell them apart individually while out in the field. And I'll also note, you probably noticed all the deer we caught were wearing a mask, and that's to help them stay calm while we're processing them. For the bucks, a really interesting thing with bucks is that their necks change size throughout the year, depending on whether or not they have antlers. And so it makes it difficult to fit collars on them. So this buck is sporting a solar-powered GPS ear tag so that we can follow his movements as well. All right, so then we continue to monitor the deer's health by listening to their collars using radio telemetry, and that allows to keep track of them throughout the study. So let's talk about some of the things that we've been learning about these deer. To date, we've captured 52 deer. Some were fawns, and those don't get instrumented. We caught some bucks. Today, I'm going to be sharing information from the 33 does, or female deer, that we've been able to study for a month or longer. So let's start off with some of the general ecology that we've learned. The first thing I want to share is about deer home ranges. So here are all 33 doe, and the average size of their home range is 1.2 kilometers squared, which is equivalent to about 3/4 square mile. This is a smaller home range than a lot of mule deer in the West. So a lot of places, their home ranges are more like an average of 3 kilometers squared, but some of them have home ranges up to 100 kilometers squared. So again, we're on the small side. Also, to put this in perspective, I mentioned that our deer, it's equivalent of about 3/4 of a mile squared. A mountain lion home range is 50 to 150 square miles. So you can fit a lot of deer in a single mountain lion's home range. You'll probably notice that there's some variability in the sizes of those, and we'll get into a few reasons about why that might be, but I want to zoom in on the deer in the Conejo Valley for you. And let's take a look at these 3 deer that live at Rancho Sierra Vista Satwiwa. And I'm going to try to highlight on your screen here. So this is the Dos Vientos neighborhood. Here's Reno Road right here and Potrero. And there's a couple things to note about these deer that are interesting to me. One is that none of them really crossed Potrero or even really went into the neighborhoods there, which is really interesting. They do live in a prime spot of our mountains. The marine layer comes in. There's always some kind of green vegetation for them. So perhaps the neighborhoods don't offer a lot of interest. The other thing that's cool about these deer is that their home ranges completely overlap. And that is indicating that they're probably related. It's not uncommon for mule deer to build home ranges that are, kind of right in the same vicinity as their mothers and their sisters. Okay, so we are also studying deer along the Conejo grade. And again, to orient you, here's the way station right here. This is the Camarillo Springs neighborhood right here. And there's a couple things that are really interesting. One is that these deer, in contrast to the ones at RSV, they're spending a lot more time in neighborhoods. And in fact, these two down here were probably getting fed by some folks who lived there. The other thing that's cool, so you can see the 101 crossing right through here. So this deer, D52, actually used the Camarillo Springs Road underpass to cross. She regularly crosses back and forth under the 101s and uses both sides of the freeway. Very interesting for us to observe, especially as compared to these other deer who are not doing that. Okay, so what about this seasonal resource thing I've been talking about? And do our deer migrate? In other words, are they shifting their home ranges seasonally? Well, if we zoom in on the central Santa Monica Mountains, and this is right where the Liberty Canyon overpass is going in, I put that red arrow in. Right now I'm showing you 5 deer home ranges. The yellow is the summer range and the blue is the winter range. And what I hope you're noticing is that while these home ranges are non-migratory, there are shifts kind of in the location and the size of the home ranges. We've also found that deer travel more and farther during the dry season, and that may be because they're looking for resources. So for example, D11 is a deer that lives at Paramount Ranch. This is her home range right here. And you can see that her summer home range is actually larger than her winter. Her home range was burned in the Woolsey fire. It's a very dry, hot part of our mountains, and it's not surprising to me that she's got to move around more looking for resources. In early September, she really takes advantage of the acorns that fall along that riparian corridor. So I think that's what we're seeing, that difference there. I'll also point out D16. She lives right here at Liberty Canyon along Agoura Road. And in contrast, her summer home range is actually smaller than her winter home range. And I think that's because she is shrinking to the only spot of shade in that area, which is that riparian corridor right along Agoura. So both food and thermal cover shade are really important for these deer. So this finding is really interesting when we think about the annual cycle that we've been able to observe with our deer. Our deer spend about the half of the year pretty solitary, but then in the fall, when the breeding season starts, they start to group together. We call the breeding season rut, and during this time, does will form groups with their yearling daughters, their fawns, sometimes their sisters, and then the bucks will start coming and looking for does who are going into estrus by using their sense of smell, and then they'll follow those does around until the does are ready to mate. That's called a tending breeding system. It's a very cool thing. I'm happy to talk more about the way the rut plays out in our mountains. But it is a little different than, for example, elk, which have a harem breeding system. So after the breeding season, gestation is about 200 days, and then our deer are giving birth between March and May, which is actually pretty early as compared to a lot of other parts of the state. Many mule deer give birth every year, and often with twins. And a lot of that is based on their ability to store fat during pregnancy and also lactation. Lactation is the toughest time of year for a female mule deer, with metabolic rates that are 4 to 7 times higher than other times. So if you're thinking again about what we're talking about, the seasonal variation in resources, and you're looking at these fawns here, the summer when deer are nursing is also a time when resources are pretty limited. And so it may end up being a very vulnerable time of year for our deer. I'll point out that fawns are actually born with only a single stomach, and then they develop into a ruminant and are eating grass and things like this by about 16 weeks. And their spots fade after about 2 to 3 months. So another big question for us is their mortality sources. Of the 17 known mortalities, unsurprisingly, cars and mountain lions are the big ones. One of the most deadly parts of our mountains is here right in the middle at the intersection of Mulholland and Las Virgenes, where we've had 4 deer die from being hit by cars. And then I'll give you an example of this lovely deer, D35. She's the orange GPS points on the left side of your screen. She was caught at Malibu Creek State Park and spent quite a bit of time there. And then she ended up having a fawn that she was storing right here in this little triangle between Malibu Canyon Road and Piuma. And then unfortunately, she was hit by a car along Piuma. Okay, so the big question is, what about mountain lions? Well, again, we know that deer make up 80% of the diet of mountain lions in our mountains. And so we can think of this predator-prey interaction as a constant chess match where deer are both trying to find the food they need and safe spaces, whereas the mountain lions are trying to find the deer, and they're just kind of roaming around the mountains like this. Previous research has found that mountain lions are killing more deer in chaparral ecosystems or riparian woodlands, like where this photo is taken. And that's probably because there's a lot of vegetative cover that allows them to stalk, to sneak up on deer to capture them. So what can a deer do in response? One option is for a deer to use a mixed cover habitat, like what D17 is doing here at RSV, where she's got a bunch of different kinds of shrubs that she can eat on, nothing super high, so she has good visibility and it's hard for a mountain lion to sneak up on her. Another option for deer is to use edge habitats, and that's what D16 is doing here. She along the riparian woodland that's along Agora Road at Liberty Canyon. And so here she's hanging on just on the edge of the forest. She's got that thermal cover, that shade that she really wants. It's easy for her to get to a lot of different vegetation, and it's providing visibility and cover from predators. So another option for deer is if they sense danger, they will freeze and adopt a vigilance pose. And that's where they're looking, listening, and smelling for predators. Maybe some of you have seen this when you're out hiking and a deer freezes and it starts looking at you. And I want to show you an example of that. These are pictures from a wildlife camera that I had put at a location in a creek bed where I was hoping to try to capture deer. And so I want you to pay particularly close attention to the timestamp on these photos, because one of the most interesting thing about these deer is their ability to be completely focused on vigilance for a really long time. So here in this frame, we have this spike buck. That means he's a year old and his antlers have not yet forked. And he looks like he's interested in grazing. Then he's noticing something. In this picture, it's still 11:46. And then here he's adopted that vigilance pose where he's very focused behind him. Okay, so again, 11:46. And now I'm going to show you the next picture. So there were no photos taken between 11:46 and then 12:04, which means that deer was completely frozen, trying to figure out what was going on as this mountain lion was using the cover of darkness to sneak up on him. Needless to say, I didn't end up setting a trap here since the deer that I had hoped to capture was eaten by a mountain lion. Let's talk a little bit about deer responses to people and things like development and roadways. So one of the things that we found is that on average, 20% of a deer's home range is comprised of development. And if we go back again to these deer that live at Liberty Canyon, I want you to notice that for these 6 deer, many of them are engaging with neighborhoods in some way. And what we've seen is that as overlap with development increases, there's a decrease in home range size for deer. And our smallest deer home ranges were actually the deer along the Conejo grade, as well as the deer who live out along the 405. So if we look more closely at the deer along the 405, hopefully you're noticing that their home ranges are totally overlapping with neighborhoods. We've got these 2 down here in the lower left that are completely overlapping with golf courses. And so why might deer have smaller home ranges when they're closer to development or overlapping more with development? Well, one reason is probably that neighborhoods and golf courses are irrigating vegetation, and so there's a year-round supply of tasty food for these animals. And so they don't have to travel far to go find things to eat. Another potential option is that neighborhoods might deter mountain lions, and so it's a safe place for the deer to just hunker down and hang out. What about deer responses to freeways? So we know that roadways are a source of mortality, but what about the 101, the 405? A study by Devon Fraser and colleagues at UCLA found that freeways do limit gene flow for our deer populations, which can ultimately impact their population health. And so that is, of course, part of the impetus for building the wildlife overpass. at Liberty Canyon. So this deer is D18. She lives, for the most part, south of the 101. And then you can see these lights in the background. This photo was taken as construction on the wildlife overpass was just beginning. And now looking again at these Liberty Canyon deer, and I'm now showing you their GPS points. The purple is D18. And as I said, she primarily lives south of the 101. However, she is unusual, whereas most of these deer, and we saw this with the Conejo gray deer as well, the 101, the freeway is a complete barrier to movement for them. D18 was unusual in that she actually will walk under the 101 using Liberty Canyon Road to go hang out on the north side. And we observed her doing that specifically during the rut. So again, this is where the overpass is going in, and just to remind you what it looks like, the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Overpass will be the largest wildlife overpass in the world. It's going to be helping out not just mountain lions, but plenty of other species in our area as well. And it's slated to be finished early next year. So it'll be really interesting to see how all wildlife are responding to this, given how strong a barrier freeways are to movement. Okay, so finally, let's just talk a little bit about the impacts of fire on deer. There's a couple of reasons studying fire in our mountains is particularly compelling. And one is that we actually have very little research on how wildfire in shrubland and chaparral ecosystems might impact wildlife. And of course, shrubs and chaparral are the main ecosystems that we have in the Santa Monica Mountains. Another reason we're interested in studying this is because other studies have found that burned areas can be attractive for deer as they'll come back and eat the new green vegetation that grows. And so we're really curious how deer might respond to burned areas over time. And our mountains are a great place to be studying this. Here in this image, the purple are the deer home ranges, and then I have outlined in orange fires that have happened. And in the last 12 years, the entire Santa Monica Mountains range has burned. I personally was evacuated for the 2013 Springs fire, so I'm very invested in trying to understand this question. And what I hope you'll notice is that we have some deer who have basically avoided overlapping with burned areas, and then we have other who have experienced some kind of fire. And so that means that we have an opportunity to understand how deer will respond to over time as the landscape is recovering from fire. I'm actually going to zoom in here on D39, who lives at Topanga Canyon, because I want you to see her immediate reaction to the Palisades fire that happened in January of 2025. So here's D39, and the purple is her home range, which may be a little bit hard to understand where it is, but if you've spent time at Topanga Canyon, she lives right at Trippett Ranch, which is the main entrance. And so I'm going to show you this animation here, and the blue again is her home range. The red is D39's movements, and then the orange is the edge of the Palisades fire. And then it's approaching, this line here is the Topanga Fire Road. And then up here at the top, I've got the date. And so I want you to pay attention to her movements. The fire started on January 7th, and then it reached Topanga Fire Road January 9th and 10th. So there's the 7th. And basically, her movements didn't really change relative to the fire. She kind of went and hung out towards the northern edge of her home range, but then she popped right back down to the south a couple days later. That's super interesting because she undoubtedly would have smelled the fire, maybe felt the heat from the smoke. There was also helicopters and various other firefighting, vehicles and people right there set up near her home range. And she didn't really seem to mind, which is really fascinating. We've found some other evidence that deer can be very loyal to their home ranges, and this really seems to suggest that. Okay, and here's another video. There's a deer right in the middle there. This is taken at Will Rogers State Park, and we're looking across an area that was also burned by the Palisades fire. Those mountains should be green, not brown. But as you can see, this deer has found the little patch of green that sprouted up after the rains following the fire. And so that's indicative that even if deer are displaced by a fire, they will come back, at least in the short term, as long as there's food. So stay tuned as we explore more of what may happen in the longer term. So just to summarize some of the things we've learned so far. One is that our deer are non-migratory, but they are responsive to seasonal variation in resources. They're also very aware of and responsive to humans, especially development and roadways, and we'll be studying how they respond to recreation, and I expect they have a response there as well. Mountain lions and cars are the main sources of mortality, and they appear somewhat resilient to fire, at least in the short term. One thing I really want to underscore is that climate change could really add some stress for our deer. So when we think about climate change impacts, we're thinking about things like longer, drier summers, extended droughts, increased fires, and all of those things are going to remove vegetation that deer either need for forage or thermal cover. And that's particularly concerning for those summer months when, again, lactation is happening and the deer are most in need of those resources. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens for our population over the next 10, 20, 30 years. With that said, what I've shown you is that our deer population is very flexible in habitat use and behavior. They move around differently depending on the season. They change where their home ranges are. They're adaptable to humans. And so that gives us a lot of hope that this population can continue to persist and that we can continue to coexist with them in this space. Yeah. So I'm going to pause there and thank you all so much for listening. I want to acknowledge that the research I do is on traditional ancestral indigenous lands, and I'm very grateful to be able to care for the land through the research that we do and work on these places that are so beautiful and important. There's so many amazing people who've been involved in this research that I am very grateful to, and many funding agencies as well. And I'm happy to take any questions that people might have.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ellie. A very great presentation. And I'm going to pass it over to Ann Russell and let you guys handle Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you. That was great, Ellie. I really appreciate it. We had a question about the overpass, and you did discuss it at some length, but I'm interested to hear, maybe to have you speculate a little bit about what will happen next when it's actually completed. Is that really going to change the dynamics? Do you think that the Liberty Canyon deer will move away once they have that option?
That's such a good question. Thank you. And also I love speculating. So, so a couple things to note about the overpass. The primary goal of the overpass is to promote connectivity of populations. And what we mean by that is we want animals to be able to move across the freeway in order for there to be gene flow, or so that they can meet basic needs in life processes. And so in terms of what the overpass might mean for the deer that already live there, generally mule deer are, and I've kind of alluded to this, but they're very loyal to their home range. Once they've set up a spot, they really like to stay there. And so some colleagues have some great research on some deer in Northern California that experienced fires during the Mendocino complex. And those deer left when the fire happened, and then they came right back and set up shop in their burned, desiccated home ranges that they had been using previously. And I think for all that related deer will overlap in their home ranges, unrelated deer are much less likely to, as you noticed from the home ranges that I was showing you, where there was a lot of separation. And so I expect that for deer, what the overpass will allow will be potentially some larger home ranges, some seasonal movements. But what I don't think is going to happen is that suddenly all of the deer that live south of the 101 are just going to take off and, head north for the Simi Hills, and we'll never see them again.
Well, that's good to know. We also have a question about guessing deer's ages. I think that the person who was asking is sort of thinking that the antlers are kind of like rattlesnake tail or whatever, and that you get more as you get older. But you said, I believe, that they drop the antlers annually, right? So
let me clarify. Thanks for asking. So first I'll address how we age does, which is it's very difficult unless you can get their teeth. So basically a deer, we can tell when it's a fawn, of course, based on size. A yearling doe sometimes looks a little smaller than an adult doe. And actually this picture that I'm showing you right here of D35 is a great example of what a mature doe looks like. She's got a nice long nose and a very robust face. But other than that, we can't actually tell you their age unless we're able to look at their teeth. For bucks, it's a similar story. So yes, they drop their antlers every year. And each year that they're alive, they grow them back. The antlers will become more robust and in often cases fork. However, at a certain point, the antlers just stop forking. And so the picture that I showed you all, that individual is what we would call a 4x4. He had a double fork on each side. He was definitely older than 4 years old. You could just tell by his size and the size of his neck. For whatever reason, that's about as big as antlers get in our mountains. And I've seen very mature, healthy bucks who had to be at least 4 to 6 who only had a fork. So their antlers had only branched once. So it's not the most reliable way to age deer. Even with the bucks, we still need to look at their teeth.
We also have a question that sort of leads out of that, which is how healthy are the deer in the pictures that you showed, and how healthy are the deer in the mountains in general? You had mentioned the wasting disease has arrived, yes?
Okay, yeah, so good question. Chronic wasting disease has not yet made it to our part of California. We have 2 documented cases in the very far east over near Bishop. So it's going to take some time for that disease to move over to us, thankfully. We have not seen a whole lot of illness in our deer population. This deer is a great example of a very healthy animal. We can't even really see her ribs. She seems to have good fat content. I would say for the most part, our deer seem to be doing pretty well. The time when they're going to look the most beat up is right around September, when they're just really stretched in terms of food and they're waiting for the rains to come and see them through another year.
We have a question from one of our friends in Simi Valley saying that she's been seeing an amazing number of deer this year, that it's more than ever in the past. Have you seen anything in your research as to why there might be more activity in the Western Simi Hills, or is that just so far out of your area that it's not relevant?
That's a really interesting question. What I would say is when we see more animals, there are a couple different reasons that could be. One could be there's an actual change in population size. So there's actually more animals on the landscape. And that could happen. Last year we had some reasonable rains. It was a good fawn year. So it could be that there's just more density of deer. Another thing that can happen is that the deer are changing their behavior in some way, such that they're showing up in more visible areas. So my understanding is that a lot of the mountains, there's a lot of really dense vegetation that's pretty hard to navigate right now. And so the deer may just be like, I don't want to deal with pushing through this mustard. I'm going to go hang out somewhere that it's a little bit easier for me to be seen. We don't have density estimates for our deer population at this point, although that's something that we're working on. And then we'll be able to start to kind of explore some of the trends. Another option could be maybe there's a new development that's being built and that's pushed some deer out of their home ranges into a new area. So I can speculate, but I can't speak to one answer at this point.
We have another question about moving deer here, which is, have you seen in-migration from the north? And is that are those deer genetically different than what we have here?
There's 2 really interesting parts of that question. One is about what drives deer migration, and the other is about the genetic component. I would not be surprised if many of the deer across much of the Central Coast are actually non-migratory. Again, migration is driven by enough change in resources that they were forced to go somewhere else. And in the case of a lot of these deer, they're somehow able to make it work in the places that they live year round. Also, in the case of a lot of these deer, they can't actually migrate because of roadways or neighborhoods and things like that. So in order to really understand deer moving from other parts of the state in, we would need to be studying them across the rest of the state as well. Anecdotally, it seems like actually some of the deer, even in the Western Sierra, are shifting from migrating. They often do an elevational migration where they'll move up and down slope. Some of those deer are actually shifting to being more resident deer throughout the year. So I don't know that we have any evidence or reason to suspect that deer would be moving south, but that's something that it would be great to partner with the state to look at. As for the question, oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, I was going to ask a follow question, but you still have the DNA question. So
yeah, the question of the genetics is such a good one. And there's some colleagues at CDFW that are looking into that right now. There's at some point along the Central Coast, genetically and morphologically, so in other words, physically, deer shift from being what we would consider mule deer to what we would consider black-tailed deer. And there's research underway right now to try and understand where that transition might be happening. This is a thing that I love to talk about. If anyone on the call is a hunter, that's probably something you think about a lot. If you've spent time at Fort Hunter Liggett, are they mule deer or are they black-tailed deer? Maybe the answer is yes. So I don't think that we actually have a lot of mixing happening right in the Santa Monica Mountains themselves, but I think you don't have to go too far north to see that happen. With that said, the official stance right now is that black-tailed deer are actually north of the Bay Area. And the Bay Area is a pretty reasonable barrier to gene flow for a lot of animal populations. So stay tuned for research coming out of CDFW to explore that question more. Great question.
This is another, I think, speculative question, but of the 52 that you actually track, what does that represent in terms of the overall population? Is it like 1 to 10, or how many deer are really out there?
I have no idea. I mean, so if we think back to the home ranges that I was showing you, I showed you 33 home ranges. So you could kind of, extrapolate those 33 across the Santa Monica Mountains, double up some home ranges because of, related individuals being together, and you could maybe start to get an estimate. But that is actually one of our next steps for our research, using DNA that we pull out of fecal samples. So this summer, we're gonna start hiking transects, collecting deer scat. We can run the genetics on those to identify individuals, and that can help us get a density estimate. So stay tuned.
They're way more dense, though, than, say, the mountain lions because of the size of the ranges, right?
Correct. They're much more dense than the mountain lions, and that's exactly right. And yep, that smaller home range can help us understand that. The other thing I'll say, and this is an important consideration for me, is that there are certain parts of the mountains where they're a lot more dense than others. So generally the Conejo Valley area, the west end of the mountains that gets that marine layer, there's more green vegetation year round. And I feel like there's higher densities of deer in that area, Sycamore Canyon area, as compared to some of the, like if you've spent time around Chesbro Canyon, it was really scorched by the Woolsey fire. A lot of that's grown back. It's just mustard. It's very dry. There's not a lot to eat. And the deer densities seem to be a lot lower there.
Speaking of deer eating, you had mentioned that it looked like somebody in Camarillo Springs was feeding the deer. What's the official opinion on helping? I mean, humans want to help, right?
And thank you so much for that question. Please do not feed wild animals. And for that matter, please do not leave out water for wild animals. The reason for that is these animals have evolved to live in this ecosystem. They have access to water sources, and actually our deer are primarily getting water from their food, as are the mountain lions. The food that we give them does not give them adequate nutrition. And the problem is when we feed a wild animal, whether it's a deer or a coyote or something else, that animal becomes habituated to humans. It starts to equate humans with food. And that's what leads to conflict. That's what leads to the animal then being around when you don't want it, or crossing roadways and causing accidents. And so really feeding them might make you feel good because you've made an animal friend, but it's actually putting that animal in danger by bringing it closer to humans. There's also a problem with things like feeding stations or water stations because it arbitrarily brings animals together and may encourage disease transmission. So that's another reason we really want to avoid that.
So
If you want to help, oh, go ahead, Ann.
don't even put out a salt lick or anything like that?
No, please don't. And in fact, in California, we are not allowed to bait for deer hunting, which in other words, we are legally not allowed to put out things like salt licks or other such attractants. So please don't do that. It's not going to help these animals and actually may hurt them. I would say if you want to help deer and other wildlife in our mountains, the number one thing you can do is drive slowly at night. Or just drive slowly all the time. As we talked about, cars are the main source of mortality for these deer. And it's, it's happening on Mulholland, it's happening on Canaan, it's happening on our main roadways. And the same holds true for our mountain lions. Cars are the main source of mortality for our mountain lions. And so the number one thing we can do to help these animals is to be really thoughtful about our driving habits. And honestly, the other thing we can do is continue to be supportive of our federal scientists who are so imperative to keeping this research going.
One last question on predators, and this is an interesting one. Do coyotes take deer down? Is that a predator for them?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
And I didn't talk about coyotes because they're not really an issue for our deer. So coyotes are a predator for white-tailed deer back east. For our deer, the main concern is coyotes will predate fawns. And so we've gotten some really cool wildlife camera footage of a mule deer doe being aggressive towards a coyote, and it's almost undoubtedly because she was protecting her fawn from that coyote. Coyotes will certainly scavenge roadkill deer. They'll scavenge deer that mountain lions kill. But once the fawns are big enough, coyotes aren't really a concern. That's a great question.
That is very interesting. Yeah, thank you. This has really been fascinating. I think we are out of time, Bill. Are you ready to?
Yeah, I'm always ready. First of all, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, Ellie. Great presentation. And, I see deer when I'm out on the trails, and I always think, as we spoke about in the pre-meeting, wow, this is really cool seeing these little deer out here. So it's nice to understand better about how they navigate our environment, how we live with them, and how what we do can have such a big impact on our surroundings. I do have a question though, from a board member, actually. The question is, and I don't know if it's related to deer necessarily, so maybe it's a little bit outside the range of discussion, but the pronghorns in Carrizo Plain, did they ever make it? The pronghorn, I presume antelope in Carrizo Plain, did they ever make it down to the Santa Monica Mountains? Would you know?
Not that I have any documentation of, and I think we would notice if they had, because they're so obviously different from deer. They would have to cover a lot of ground and navigate a lot of agriculture and other urban settlements in order to make it down here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure what would compel them to. They are also the pronghorn that live in Carrizo. The few bits of water there are really important for those pronghorn. They're pretty keyed in on that. So I don't see that happening there. We also know from studies of pronghorn in other parts of the Western US, they do have these amazing, huge migrations, but they really struggle with crossing fencing.
Mhm.
And so I think there's just too many barriers, and I'm not sure, at this point, I'm not sure what would compel any animal to come south to where it's hotter and drier if you could find some better resources
Yeah.
in a different place. Yeah, that's a
Well,
really
and fencing is a whole other discussion as a Colorado boy, but we'll
yeah.
save that for another day.
We will.
Anyway, Ellie, thank you so much. What a great presentation. And I want to thank you, Anne, for leading us through all the questions, and thank you, attendees, for your questions, and for your participation. So, moving on, I want to say that our event has come to an end. I do have one note, and that is that I really appreciate the call out for the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. The Conejo Open Space Foundation has long been a supporter of this project, so thank you for that. Anyway, our event has come to an
And
end.
thank you for
I've
your
got
support of that. It's going to make such a difference. We're really excited about it.
of course, and we're going to continue, and look forward to more in the future, I hope. If nothing else, I hope this webinar has armed all of you with the information you need to keep an eye out for these beautiful animals that live in our valley and enjoy their presence and know what to do and what not to do, i.e., don't feed them. Don't feed any
Please.
wild animals. It's a great point. And to all of our attendees tonight, get out, enjoy the open spaces. It's summer right now, so one, make sure that you've got plenty of water. Enjoy the shade when you can. And if you're out there with your pets, be careful. Don't let them overheat. It gets hot really quick for them. They're closer to the ground than we are. Please stay on the trail and report any damage you may find to our website under trail report forms, trail watch report. Take lots of photos, soak in the beauty, and please continue to be partners with us in the months and years to come. Thank you for your donations, your volunteerism, and your participation. I'll see you all out on the trails. And until next time, have a good evening. And once again, thank you very much, Ellie. What a great presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Feel free to get in touch if other questions come up. Always love talking about deer.